March 1965. The coast of South Vietnam. American Marines step off landing craft and walk across the sand toward the base at Da Nang. They are met by journalists, photographers, government officials. At first glance, it all looks almost routine. Just another U.S. military operation, somewhere far from home. Officially, Washington says these troops are not here to fight a major war. Their mission is simple: protect airfields and key facilities. This is not an invasion, not an escalation, not the beginning of a new disaster. But in reality, something much bigger is happening. For the first time, large U.S. combat units are entering Vietnam, not as advisors, not as instructors, but as an army that will soon be fighting the war itself. Within a few years, more than 500,000 American soldiers will be stationed in Vietnam. The conflict will become one of the longest, most expensive, and most controversial wars in U.S. history. But on that day, almost no one is thinking about a decade-long war. Most politicians in Washington believe the United States is simply taking another step to stabilize the situation and prevent the collapse of an ally. And that was the central mistake, because the United States did not enter the Vietnam War with a single decision, and it did not happen in a single day. America drifted into the war gradually, step by step, year by year, until one day it became clear there was no easy way out. To understand how that happened, we need to go back to the moment when France left Vietnam and the United States decided to take its place. In 1954, France suffers a decisive defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The loss effectively ends France's colonial presence in Indochina. At the Geneva Conference, world powers agreed to temporarily divide Vietnam along the 17th parallel. The northern part of the country comes under the control of the communist government led by Ho Chi Minh. The south remains under an anti-communist regime. The division is supposed to be temporary. National elections are planned for 2 years later, with the goal of reunifying the country. But those elections never happen. The leadership in the South, supported by the United States, fears that the communists would easily win the vote. Instead of reunification, Vietnam gradually turns into a front line of the Cold War. For American policymakers, Vietnam becomes part of a much larger strategy. In Washington, a new idea begins to dominate thinking. It's known as the domino theory. The logic is simple. If one country becomes communist, its neighbors might follow. Many politicians fear that if South Vietnam falls, communism could spread across Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia. In the atmosphere of the Cold War, these scenarios are seen as a serious threat. And so the United States begins to gradually increase its support for South Vietnam. At first, it looks like limited assistance, military advisors, funding for the army, shipments of equipment. But over time, America's involvement begins to grow deeper. The main pillar of the anti-communist government is President Ngo Dinh Diem. Washington hopes he will be able to build a stable state in the South. But, in reality, his government faces serious problems. Diem pursues a harsh policy against the opposition. Political opponents are arrested. Protests are suppressed. Tensions become especially severe between the Catholic government and the country's Buddhist majority. By the early 1960s, dissatisfaction inside the country is growing. In rural areas, a guerrilla movement begins to gain strength. It will later become known as the Viet Cong. This creates a new problem for the United States. South Vietnam proves too unstable to stand on its own against the North. When John F. Kennedy becomes president in 1961, about 900 American military advisors are already working in Vietnam. Kennedy decides to increase that number. By 1963, there are roughly 16,000 U.S. advisors in the country. Formally, this is still not considered a war. American personnel are there to train the South Vietnamese army and help plan military operations. But the situation on the ground continues to deteriorate. Guerrilla warfare spreads across the countryside. The government in Saigon begins to lose control over larger and larger areas of the country, and political instability only continues to grow. By the fall of 1963, the situation reaches a breaking point. Mass Buddhist protests spread across the country. Photographs of monks setting themselves on fire circle the world. Diem's government begins to lose support even among its own allies. In November 1963, a group of South Vietnamese generals stages a coup. President Ngo Dinh Diem is killed. But instead of bringing stability, the country falls into even deeper chaos. Over the next 2 years, several different governments will come and go in South Vietnam. For the United States, the conclusion becomes clear. Their ally in the South is simply too weak. In the summer of 1964, an event occurs that will change the scale of the conflict. An American destroyer, the USS Maddox, is operating in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. On August 2nd, the ship encounters several North Vietnamese patrol boats. A brief clash follows. 2 days later, reports arrive of a second attack. Years later, evidence will suggest that this second incident most likely never happened. But at the time, the information is treated as a real threat. President Lyndon Johnson addresses Congress. Within days, lawmakers pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The document effectively gives the president broad authority to use military force in Vietnam. Formally, war is still not declared, but from this moment on, the United States has the legal basis to begin full-scale military operations. In 1965, the United States launches a major military campaign. Operation Rolling Thunder begins, a long and sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. At the same time, American troops start arriving in South Vietnam. What had once been called limited support is now turning into direct military involvement. The number of American soldiers grows rapidly. By the end of the decade, more than 500,000 U.S. troops will be stationed in Vietnam. But the war that many in Washington expected to be a short operation turns out to be far more complicated. The decision to intervene in Vietnam was driven by several factors. The first was the fear of communism spreading. During the Cold War, any defeat was seen as a global threat. The second factor was political pressure inside the United States. American leaders were afraid of appearing weak in front of their rivals. The third factor was gradual escalation. Each new decision seemed logical at the moment it was made. But together, those decisions pulled the country deeper and deeper into the conflict. By the mid-1960s, the United States is already fully involved in the Vietnam War. The American military becomes the main fighting force in the south of the country. But the more troops arrive, the more one problem becomes clear. Victory is far more difficult than Washington had expected, and within a few years, an event will take place that changes the way this war is seen not only in Vietnam, but in the United States itself. The Tet Offensive. The moment that will show the world that the war is not going the way politicians and generals had promised. And that is the story we will explore in the next video.